June 4th, 1942. Dawn breaks over the central Pacific, painting the horizon in shades of amber and gold. Aboard the carrier Akagi, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stands on the flight deck, watching his pilots prepare for another sortie. The same man who led the strike on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier now commands the most powerful carrier striking force the world has ever seen. Around him, mechanics swarm over Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, their engines warming in the tropical air. The deck vibrates with controlled energy. Fuchida allows himself a rare smile. The Americans have sent their carriers into a trap, and by noon, the Pacific will belong to Japan. On the decks of 3 other carriers, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, similar scenes unfold. Pilots joke about the coming victory, their laughter carrying across the water. Some have painted victory marks on their aircraft, counting the American ships they expect to sink today. None of them know that in less than 6 hours, 3 of these 4 carriers will be burning wrecks, and the course of the entire war will have reversed in the span of 5 minutes. 6 months earlier, on December 7th, 1941, those same Japanese pilots had achieved what military historians would call the most successful carrier raid in naval history. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. 8 American battleships had been sunk or damaged, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet appeared crippled beyond immediate recovery. In the months that followed, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave. The Philippines fell. Singapore, the great British fortress in the Far East, surrendered in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. The Dutch East Indies, with their vital oil reserves, came under Japanese control. Burma's jungles echoed with the sound of Japanese boots. Wake Island, Guam, the Gilbert Islands, each fell in turn, each victory reinforcing the growing belief among Japanese aviators that they were invincible. Their carriers had operated across thousands of miles of ocean without serious opposition. Their Zero fighters dominated every air battle. Their torpedo bombers struck with devastating accuracy. The American Navy, they believed, was a broken force, its surviving carriers scattered and hiding, its pilots inexperienced and afraid. Admiral Ezuroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, knew better. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood what many of his subordinates did not. The attack had failed in its primary objective. Not a single American aircraft carrier had been in harbor that December morning. The Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga remained operational, and carriers, not battleships, would decide this war. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard, had traveled across America, had seen its industrial might firsthand. He knew Japan's window of opportunity was closing. Every month America remained in the war, its factories would produce more ships, more aircraft, more of everything. Japan needed a decisive battle, one that would destroy America's carrier force and force Washington to negotiate a peace that left Japan's conquered empire intact. Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, became the bait for his trap. Yamamoto assembled the most powerful naval force in Japanese history. 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, 46 destroyers, and multiple support vessels. Over 250 aircraft would strike Midway, soften its defenses, and draw out the American carriers. When they arrived, weakened and unsupported, Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes would annihilate them. But in a basement beneath Pearl Harbor, a team of American cryptanalysts had been working 18-hour days for months. Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had partially broken the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. They couldn't read everything, but they could read enough. Through fragments and cross-references, they identified a target designated AF as the objective of a major Japanese operation. Rochefort suspected AF was Midway, but needed confirmation. In a brilliant deception, he had Midway send an uncoded message reporting their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Days later, Japanese intelligence reported that AF was experiencing freshwater problems. The trap was confirmed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, now knew when and where the Japanese would strike. He had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea just weeks earlier. Against Yamamoto's armada, it seemed impossibly inadequate. But Nimitz had one advantage Yamamoto didn't know he'd lost: surprise. The Japanese believed the American carriers were still near the Solomon Islands, thousands of miles away. Instead, Nimitz positioned them northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the horizon, waiting. The confidence of Japanese pilots on the morning of June 4th was not simple arrogance. It was born from experience and success. For months they had faced minimal opposition. American fighters were slower, less maneuverable. American pilots often broke formation under pressure. American anti-aircraft fire was intense but inaccurate. In every engagement, Japanese aviators had emerged victorious. Aboard Akagi, pilots like Zenji Abe and Haruo Yoshino had survived dozens of combat missions. They had struck Pearl Harbor, had bombed Darwin in Australia, had ranged across the Indian Ocean, sinking British cruisers. They wore their flight suits with the pride of samurai warriors, and in their minds, they were conducting a modern version of Bushido, the way of the warrior. When word reached the carrier decks that American aircraft were in the area, the reaction was almost dismissive. Let them come. Let them throw themselves against Japanese steel and fire. Their fate was already written. Some pilots actually requested permission to launch immediately, eager to add more American aircraft to their personal tallies. On Kaga's ready room, a blackboard displayed the expected results of the day. 4 American carriers sunk, Midway captured, Japanese losses minimal. No one questioned those numbers. But at that same moment, American pilots were preparing for a mission most believed would be their last. Aboard Enterprise and Hornet, torpedo bomber crews ran through final checks on their Douglas TBD Devastators, aircraft that were slow, poorly armed, and already obsolete. Their torpedoes were notoriously unreliable, often running too deep or failing to detonate. To attack, they would need to fly low and straight toward enemy ships bristling with anti-aircraft guns, all while Japanese Zeros dove on them from above. The math was brutal, and everyone knew it. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leader of Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, gathered his 15 crews before launch. He told them they were probably going to die. He told them to make sure their deaths counted. He told them that if only one plane survived to make an attack, it should be his, because he knew how to find the Japanese fleet. Then he shook each man's hand and climbed into his aircraft. At 0806 hours, Torpedo 8 launched into a clear blue sky. Every man aboard knew the odds. Every man went anyway. This wasn't overconfidence. This was courage born from desperation, from knowing that if they didn't stop the Japanese carriers here, the war might be lost. The Japanese carriers had launched their strike against Midway at 0430 hours. 108 aircraft that bombed the atoll's installations, but failed to neutralize its defenses completely. The strike leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, radioed back a request for a second strike. This message triggered a fatal chain of decisions. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier force, had kept 93 aircraft in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against American ships. When Tomonaga's request came through, and with no American carriers detected, Nagumo ordered these aircraft rearmed with land bombs for a second Midway strike. Mechanics immediately began removing torpedoes and anti-ship bombs, stacking them haphazardly on the hangar decks while loading high-explosive bombs meant for ground targets. It was a complex operation requiring nearly an hour. Then, at 07:28 hours, a Japanese scout plane finally reported spotting American ships. At 08:09, the scout clarified, one of them appeared to be a carrier. Nagumo froze. His aircraft were in the worst possible state, half rearmed, unable to launch immediately. He ordered them switched back to anti-ship weapons. The hangar decks descended into controlled chaos. Torpedoes were reattached. Bombs were swapped again. Fuel lines snaked across the deck. And the carriers remained vulnerable, their decks crowded with aircraft, their hangars stacked with ordnance. Then, the American torpedo bombers arrived. Torpedo Squadron 8 found the Japanese carriers at 09:18 hours. Waldron waggled his wings and led his 15 Devastators straight into hell. They came in low over the water, spread out in attack formation, and immediately every Japanese ship opened fire. The sky erupted with black bursts of anti-aircraft shells. Zero fighters dove from above like hawks on sparrows. One Devastator exploded in midair. Another cartwheeled into the sea trailing smoke. Waldron's aircraft took hits, caught fire, but he held his course until the flames forced him down. Within minutes, 14 of 15 aircraft were destroyed. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water amid burning wreckage, watching the battle unfold around him. They launched no effective torpedoes. They scored no hits. They died for nothing, or so it seemed. Minutes later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived, then Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. They met the same murderous reception. More Devastators fell burning from the sky. More American pilots died in the water or went down with their aircraft. Of 41 torpedo bombers launched that morning, only 6 would return. The attack appeared to be a catastrophic failure, but those doomed torpedo bomber crews accomplished something they would never know. They drew every Japanese fighter down to wave-top level. They forced the carriers to maneuver constantly, breaking formation. They kept the Japanese so focused on the low-altitude threat that no one looked up. And at 10,000 feet, unnoticed and unopposed, 37 American dive bombers were approaching their attack positions. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour. His fuel was running low. He had almost turned back when he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer steaming northeast at high speed. The destroyer Arashi had been delayed by dropping depth charges on an American submarine. McCluskey made a calculated guess. That destroyer was rushing to rejoin the main force. He followed its wake. At 10:20 hours, he looked down and saw what no American pilot had seen in 6 months of war. Japanese carriers caught completely vulnerable. Their decks were crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed. Their fighters were all at low altitude, still engaged with the last torpedo bombers. The carriers were turning independently, having broken defensive formation during the torpedo attacks. McCluskey pushed over into his dive without hesitation. What happened in the next 5 minutes changed the Pacific War. McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise split into two groups. One section, led by Lieutenant Richard Best, dove on Akagi. The other, under Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, targeted Kaga. At nearly the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's dive bombers onto Soryu. The Japanese lookout spotted them too late. The carriers attempted to maneuver, but aircraft crowded their decks and limited their ability to turn sharply. Anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and poorly aimed. The gun crews had been focused downward, not upward. The dive bombers came down at 70-degree angles, approaching 250 miles per hour, releasing their 1,000-pound bombs at 1,500 feet before pulling out of their dives just above the water. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck Akagi dead center, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the upper hangar where aircraft were being refueled and rearmed. The resulting explosion ignited aviation gasoline and detonated stacked torpedoes and bombs. Within seconds, Akagi transformed from the pride of the Japanese fleet into a floating inferno. Fire raced through the ship. Secondary explosions threw aircraft and men into the air. Nagumo and his staff were forced to evacuate the bridge. Kaga fared even worse. Multiple bombs struck her flight deck in rapid succession. One penetrated to the hangar deck, where it detonated among rearming aircraft, triggering a catastrophic chain reaction. Fuel, bombs, and torpedoes exploded simultaneously. The carrier's entire midsection erupted in flames, reaching hundreds of feet into the air. Crewmen were blown overboard by the blast. Others were trapped below decks as fire consumed the passageways. On Soryu, 3 bombs hit within 2 minutes. One struck the forward elevator, jamming it in the raised position and preventing firefighting crews from accessing the hangar deck. The other 2 penetrated into the hangars, where the same deadly recipe of fuel, bombs, and aircraft created instant disaster. All 3 carriers were mortally wounded before their crews understood what had happened. The proud carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were now blazing wrecks, their steel decks buckling from internal heat, their magazines cooking off in secondary explosions that sent shudders through their hulls. Black smoke pillared thousands of feet into the tropical sky, visible for 50 miles. 5 minutes. 5 minutes had reversed 6 months of Japanese victories and transformed the Pacific balance of power. The 4th carrier, Soryu, had been separated from the others and escaped the dive bomber attack. Her captain, Tomeo Kaku, immediately launched a counterstrike against Yorktown, proving that Japanese aviators could still fight with devastating skill, even in defeat. His pilots crippled Yorktown, forcing her abandonment. But American search planes located Soryu that afternoon, and dive bombers from Enterprise found her at 1700 hours. 4 bombs struck the carrier, and she too became a floating torch. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning or sinking. Akagi was scuttled by Japanese destroyers the following morning. Kaga sank by herself, her hull finally giving way to uncontrolled fires. Soryu slipped beneath the waves in the evening of June 4th, taking hundreds of her crew with her. Soryu lingered until dawn of June 5th before she too disappeared into the Pacific depths. The statistics are stark, but they barely capture the magnitude of the disaster. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 men, including some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Pilots who had trained for years, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, who were irreplaceable gone. The Americans lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. But more significantly, America had proven its carriers could strike back effectively, that its intelligence could outthink Japanese planning, and that its pilots, inexperienced as they were, could fight with extraordinary courage, and with luck, devastating effectiveness. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted in those 5 minutes over the Japanese carriers. Japan would never again conduct offensive carrier operations. America would never again fight on the defensive. The mockery of Japanese pilots that morning was understandable given their experience, but it revealed a fatal flaw in their strategic thinking. They had confused tactical victories with strategic invulnerability. They had underestimated American determination and adaptability. They had allowed a series of successes to blind them to fundamental vulnerabilities in their operational procedures, particularly the dangerous practice of rearming aircraft on crowded hangar decks surrounded by fuel lines. The American dive bombers didn't just sink carriers. They punished overconfidence with fire and exposed the fragility behind Japanese military supremacy. Those torpedo bomber crews, slaughtered to the last man, seemingly dying for nothing, had actually created the conditions for victory. Their sacrifice drew the Japanese fighters away, exhausted the defenders, and set the stage for the dive bombers' unopposed approach. War is rarely fair in distributing credit. The torpedo squadrons received posthumous recognition, but the dive bomber pilots became the heroes. Both were essential. Both paid in blood. Midway marked the end of Japanese expansion and the beginning of America's long march across the Pacific. Guadalcanal would follow, then Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each island a stepping stone toward Japan itself. The carriers America built in the years after Midway would eventually number over 100, while Japan struggled to replace even the 4 lost in that single morning. The confident pilots who mocked American capabilities on June 4, 1942, had no way of knowing they were standing on the edge of an abyss. The dive bombers that turned the Pacific sky into fire didn't just sink ships. They shattered an illusion of invincibility and proved that in modern warfare, a single moment of vulnerability can undo months of victories. The flames that consumed Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu burned away Japanese hopes of winning the Pacific War, and in their light, a different future became visible, one where American carriers ruled the ocean and Japanese pilots would spend the rest of the war fighting an increasingly desperate defensive battle they could not win.